Hello, my name is David Perrier, and this is my presentation for Info 668, The History of the Book. This presentation is going to look at the importance of the book in a major event in human history. We are going to look at the impact of the book on the American Revolutionary War. It could be hard to think that books would have an important impact on an event as huge as the American Revolution. But books have had effects on the course of human events that have rippled through time without us ever even noticing. After this presentation, you should be able to see that the impact of a single book hundreds of years ago can help shape the world that we know today, and that this process is not that uncommon at all. One of the more important events in recent human history is the American Revolution. Although the conflict is taught in every school in America and every school child, the influence of books on the outcome of the conflict is rarely ever mentioned. Now, whether or not books even had a significant impact on the American Revolution is not a widely covered topic. But it seems to me that the United States can, at least partially, thank the book for its existence as an independent nation. In this presentation, we're going to look at why the book had such an important impact and how it influenced one of the most important events in American history. But in order to understand the impact of books, we need to look at books specifically rather than generally. And specifically, we need to look at the importance of one book in particular, Common Sense by Thomas Paine. This book was published in 1776 and sold between 75,000 and 100,000 copies, and up to 500,000 copies depending on the source. At the time, the population of America was only around 2.1 million people. In the book, Thomas Paine argued two main points: independence from England and the creation of a democratic republic. His fiery message was taken on by the average colonial and made the book instrumental in bringing the colonies together and uniting them for a single purpose and a single goal. It swayed Americans over to the side of the Patriots and helped influence the masses into supporting the rebel cause. Now you might be asking, why would there be a need to bring the colonies together? Weren't they already angry with the king over taxation? And the answer to that would be both yes and no. And in order to understand the situation more clearly, we need to take a step back and try to understand a little more about the events that led to the American Revolution and the relationship that the colonies had with England, as well as with each other. The call of no taxation without representation is known to everyone who learns about the Revolution. This call came as a result of England raising taxes to pay for the cost of the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763. The war lasted 9 years, and the cost of campaigning for so long and over such a large area resulted in the British borrowing heavily to finance the war. In fact, by the time the war was over, the national debt almost doubled from £75 million in 1754 to £133 million in 1763. In order to pay for the war, England decided to increase taxes on the colonies, since England felt that the colonies should help paying in the costs associated with defending them. These new tax increases were very unpopular in the colonies and angered many colonists. But there were other events as well. The Boston Massacre and the Intolerable Acts, which consisted of the Boston Port Act, the Justice Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Quartering Act, and the Quebec Act, helped to increase tensions and all had parts to play in the events that unfolded. But even though these issues were important to the colonials, they still found a divided society, without a common cause or a single plan that all could agree on. In fact, no two colonies were treated or controlled in the same way by England, and therefore each had a different perspective on English control. Looking at the Intolerable Acts in particular, you could probably guess which state was most affected. As the names of most of these issues show, Boston Tea Party, Boston Massacre, Boston Port Act, Massachusetts Government Act, these acts mostly affected the colony of Massachusetts. And this should come as no surprise, considering that the Intolerable Acts were put in place solely to punish Massachusetts. Not only that, the colonies weren't even founded for the same reasons. Virginia was originally started as a mercantile colony that was run by a company. Massachusetts was originally a Puritan theocracy. New York was a crown colony that had been taken over from the Dutch. Maryland and Pennsylvania were religiously tolerant colonies governed by hereditary feudal rulers. And South Carolina was more similar to a Caribbean colony than its own continental neighbors. It's probably not surprising that people don't always agree on what course of action to take. Like many times in American history, Americans were not in agreement about what should be done. It was said by Claude Van Tyne, author of The Loyalists in the American Revolution, that the great majority of men could be regarded as indifferent, ready to stampede and rush along with the successful party, and that among the masses there was still the traditional love of kingship, which had to be reckoned with and combated. Despite all the recent hardships, the majority of colonists since birth were reared to believe that England was to be loved and its monarch revered. In fact, up until the end of the French and Indian Wars, there were very few colonists in British North America who objected to their place within the British Empire. Fear was another factor swaying the opinions of the colonists. Any student of history is familiar with the harsh treatment that the British used against Irish rebels, and there was no reason to think that they would be treated differently. In fact, Claude Van Tyne stated that the patriots were the ones that had to do the converting, the changing of men's opinions to suit a new order of things, which the revolutionists believed necessary for their own and their country's welfare. Such persuasion would not be necessary if everyone was already in agreement about what course of action that they should take. So what helped bring people in the colonies together? Well, there is no one cause that brought everyone together, because the colonies were never truly united as one over the course of the entire revolution. And there was no way to determine in a simple value what exact impact the book had in the war for independence. But one can look at what people at the time and people today feel was important in bringing the colonists together for a common cause. In 2011, Jack Fruchtman Jr., the author of Thomas Paine, Apostle of Freedom, in an interview with the Tribune newspaper, said that common sense was so influential that anyone sitting on the fence who encountered common sense was probably no longer sitting on the fence, and that common sense helped to usher in American independence. Winthrop D. Jordan, in the article Familial Politics, Thomas Paine and the Killing of the King, 1776, said that common sense was the one piece of political writing which everyone at the time acknowledged to have by far the greatest influence on the public mind. He also stated that common sense was easily the most extended and the most vehement of the political writings at the time. Winthrop also believed that with the possible exception of Uncle Tom's Cabin, common sense was demonstrably the most immediately influential political or social tract ever published in the United States. Now, past views of the effects of common sense on the Revolutionary War are also important. The Connecticut Gazette printed an article in 1776 that stated, "We were blind, but on reading these enlightening works the scales have fallen from our eyes." They also stated that, when referring to Thomas Paine's writings in Common Sense, "You have declared the sentiment of millions." Even George Washington, the leader of the Continental Army and first President of the United States, when writing a letter to Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Reed in April of 1776, wrote that, "By private letters, which I have lately received from Virginia, I find common sense is working a powerful change there in the minds of many men." Nor was he the only one in his time to see the significance of Thomas Paine's writings. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, received a copy from her husband, and wrote to him saying that this book, "'tis highly prized here, and carries conviction wherever it is read." Common Sense had an important impact on the public opinion of many Americans at the time. The book was said to produce surprising effects. Many thousands were convinced and were led to approve and long for a separation from the mother country. Although only one part of many writings for American independence at the time, it was an important part of the revolutionary cause. In fact, it was said by John Adams in 1805 that, "I know not whether any man in the world has had more influence on its inhabitants or affairs for the last 30 years than Tom Paine." Although it can be difficult to put an absolute value on a book and the effects that it had in the American Revolution, there can be no doubt that it played a significant role. People from the time, up to historians today, agree that it had at least some impact on colonial support for the rebellion. It helped to bring unity to the colonial cause where there was a lot of division. And the book also had more long-lasting consequences. It helped to play a role in the French Revolution that would take place only a few years later in 1789. Now, it may be hard to believe that one book could have such an important impact on a major event in American history, but Common Sense was instrumental in the patriot cause for the American colonies. It helped to build the foundation that we lived on to this day. And one small book whose effects are still felt hundreds of years later. I hope from this presentation that you have a greater understanding of how important books could be in the direction of human history. Well, thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I definitely hope you learned something. It could be hard to believe that one book could play an important role in a major event in American history. But common sense was instrumental in the patriot cause for freedom in the American colonies. Common sense helped build the foundation that we live on to this very day. It's one small book whose effects are still being felt hundreds of years later. And I hope from this presentation you gained a great understanding of how important books could be in the direction of human history.